In the grand narrative of American history, certain wars are etched into the national consciousness with vivid clarity. The Revolution, the Civil War, the World Wars, these conflicts are memorialized in monuments, taught in every classroom, and recounted in countless films. Yet there exists a chapter in America's story that is often relegated to a footnote. A conflict that was brutal, consequential, and deeply revealing of the nation's burgeoning global ambitions. This was the Philippine-American War, a bloody struggle that officially lasted from 1899 to 1902, though fighting continued for years afterward. It pitted the armed forces of the United States against the First Philippine Republic, a nation that had just declared its independence from centuries of Spanish rule, only to find itself facing a new powerful colonizer. This conflict is frequently called America's First Forgotten War, a title it tragically earns by its absence from popular memory. The reasons for this collective amnesia are complex, tied to the uncomfortable truths the war exposed about the United States at the turn of the 20th century. It was a war that directly contradicted the nation's founding ideals of liberty and self-determination. While America was presenting itself as a liberator on the world stage, its soldiers were engaged in a difficult and often savage campaign to suppress a people fighting for the very same freedoms that Americans held sacred. The war was messy, morally ambiguous, and ultimately a stark deviation from the story America liked to tell about itself. The Philippine-American War was not a minor skirmish, it was a major military undertaking that involved over 126,000 American soldiers and resulted in immense human suffering. The conflict unfolded in two distinct and devastating phases. The first was a period of conventional warfare, where the fledgling Filipino army attempted to meet the well-equipped American forces in open battle. The second, longer phase was a protracted guerrilla war, where Filipino fighters melted into the jungles and mountains, leading to a brutal counterinsurgency campaign by the United States. This shift in tactics brought the war to the civilian population in horrifying ways, forever changing the landscape of the archipelago and the relationship between the two nations. Understanding this forgotten war is crucial to understanding the trajectory of both the United States and the Philippines. For America, it marked the true beginning of its journey as a global imperial power, an uncomfortable inheritance that would shape its foreign policy for the next century. For the Philippines, it was a tragic interruption of its national birth, a violent struggle that would delay its independence for nearly half a century, and leave deep, lasting scars on its society and psyche. To unveil this conflict is to look into a mirror and see a different, more complicated version of American history, one that is essential for a complete picture of the nation's past and its place in the world today. The story of the Philippine-American War begins not with an American invasion, but with a seemingly shared goal, the defeat of Spain. By 1898, the Spanish Empire was a shadow of its former self, clinging desperately to its last significant colonies, including Cuba and the Philippines. In the Philippines, a powerful nationalist movement had been brewing for years, culminating in the Philippine Revolution of 1896. Led by figures like Emilio Aguinaldo, Filipino revolutionaries had fought fiercely for their independence, establishing a government in exile and demonstrating a profound desire for self-rule. They had managed to pin down Spanish forces, controlling large swaths of the countryside even before the first American ship appeared on the horizon. When the United States declared war on Spain in April 1898, ostensibly over Spanish brutalities in Cuba, the Philippines became a strategic second front. On May 1st, Commodore George Dewey sailed the U.S. Asiatic Squadron into Manila Bay and, in a matter of hours, decimated the antiquated Spanish fleet. Dewey, however, had no ground troops to take the capital city of Manila. It was at this moment that a fragile and ultimately doomed alliance was forged. American officials sought out the exiled Aguinaldo, encouraging him to return to the Philippines and rally his forces against the Spanish. Aguinaldo was led to believe through ambiguous promises and gestures that the United States had no territorial ambitions and supported the cause of Filipino independence. Trusting these assurances, Aguinaldo returned, and his revolutionary army quickly proved to be an indispensable ally. Within weeks, Filipino forces had driven the Spanish from nearly every part of the archipelago, cornering the remaining Spanish garrison within the walled city of Manila. On June 12, 1898, with victory seemingly at hand, Aguinaldo formally declared the independence of the Philippines, establishing the first constitutional republic in Asia. A new flag was raised, a national anthem was played, and the Filipino people celebrated what they believed was the dawn of their freedom. They saw the Americans not as new masters, but as partners in liberation, a powerful friend who would help them secure their hard-won sovereignty. This belief, however, was a profound miscalculation based on hope and misunderstanding. While Filipino soldiers were fighting and dying to liberate their homeland, a different plan was taking shape in Washington and among American commanders in Manila. The United States had no intention of allowing the Philippines to become an independent nation. The focus was on defeating Spain and claiming its colonial possessions as spoils of war. In a carefully orchestrated event, the Americans arranged a mock battle for Manila with the Spanish governor-general. This sham fight was designed to allow Spain to surrender the city to the Americans, not the Filipinos, thereby saving Spanish honor and pointedly excluding the Filipino army that had surrounded the city for months. The moment of betrayal was formalized thousands of miles away, in a city that had no connection to the tropical islands whose fate was being decided. In December 1898, representatives from the United States and Spain met in Paris to negotiate the end of their war. The Filipino people, whose soldiers had done most of the fighting on the ground, were not given a seat at the table. Their newly declared republic was not recognized. Their pleas for representation were ignored. The discussions were not about liberation or self-determination, but about territory, commerce, and the transfer of colonial property from one empire to another. The future of the Philippines was being sold, and its people were treated as little more than a commodity. The resulting document, the Treaty of Paris, was a stunning blow to Filipino aspirations. In Article 3 of the treaty, Spain ceded the Philippine Islands to the United States in exchange for a payment of $20 million. With the stroke of a pen, the archipelago and its millions of inhabitants were transferred from one colonial master to another. The transaction was justified in America by a mixture of motives that President William McKinley would later describe as a divine calling. He spoke of the need to uplift and civilize and Christianize the Filipinos, ignoring the fact that the vast majority had been Catholic for centuries. This rhetoric of benevolent assimilation masked a cruder reality. The Philippines offered a strategic foothold in Asia, a gateway to the lucrative markets of China, and a chance for America to join the club of global imperial powers. For the Filipinos, the news of the treaty was met with disbelief, which quickly turned to outrage and a profound sense of betrayal. They had been used. Their alliance with the Americans, which they had entered into with good faith, was revealed to be a strategic deception. Emilio Aguinaldo and the leaders of the new republic had trusted the Americans, believing they shared a common belief in the principles of freedom. Now they saw that they had merely helped one colonizer expel another. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the flag, all the symbols of their hard-won nationhood, were rendered meaningless by a distant diplomatic agreement. The choice before them was stark: accept a new form of colonial subjugation or fight for their independence once more. The sentiment of the time was captured perfectly by Aguinaldo himself, who later reflected on the deep sense of injustice. He stated, "I have been deceived. The Americans have us in their clutches, not to free us, but to subjugate us." This feeling permeated Filipino society. Having fought for so long against Spain, the idea of simply laying down their arms and accepting American rule was unthinkable. The Filipino army, which had effectively controlled the entire country outside of Manila, refused to disband. They began to dig trenches and fortify their positions around the capital, facing the American troops who had once been their allies. The air grew thick with tension, and the two armies watched each other across a fragile, shrinking no-man's land. War was not just possible, it was becoming inevitable. The fragile peace between the two armies, encamped around the edges of Manila, was destined to shatter. By early 1899, the city was a powder keg of suspicion and hostility. American soldiers, filled with a sense of racial and national superiority, often referred to the Filipinos with derogatory slurs and treated them with contempt. The Filipino soldiers, for their part, viewed the Americans as occupiers who had stolen their victory and were now denying them their freedom. They stood their ground, determined to defend the republic they had proclaimed. Both sides were on a hair trigger, and it would only take a single incident to ignite a full-scale conflict that would engulf the islands for years to come. That incident occurred on the night of February 4, 1899, on a bridge in the Santa Mesa district of Manila. An American patrol, led by Private William Grayson, encountered a group of Filipino soldiers. According to Grayson's account, he shouted, "Halt!" The Filipino soldiers did not stop, and after a second warning, Grayson fired, killing one of the men. The Filipino survivors returned fire, and within minutes the shooting spread along the 10-mile line separating the two armies. American commanders, seemingly prepared for such a moment, immediately launched a pre-planned offensive. By morning, a full-scale battle was raging, marking the official start of the Philippine-American War. The question of who fired the first shot has been debated by historians, but the larger context makes the detail almost irrelevant. President McKinley had already made his intentions clear with his benevolent assimilation proclamation, declaring American sovereignty over the entire archipelago. The U.S. Senate was on the verge of ratifying the Treaty of Paris, and news of the outbreak of hostilities helped sway a few undecided votes, securing the treaty's passage by a narrow margin. To many, the timing seemed incredibly convenient for the American administration. The conflict provided a clear justification for a military campaign that many in Washington already wanted, framing it not as a war of conquest, but as a necessary response to a Filipino insurrection. For the Filipinos, the battle was a catastrophic blow. Their leaders, including Aguinaldo, had not expected the war to begin so suddenly, and had hoped for a diplomatic resolution. They were caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the American assault. The U.S. forces, armed with modern Springfield rifles and superior artillery, quickly overwhelmed the Filipino positions around Manila. In the first few days of fighting, thousands of Filipino soldiers were killed, while American casualties were comparatively light. It was a brutal introduction to the reality of modern industrial warfare, and it signaled the beginning of a long and bloody struggle for the future of the Philippines. The fleeting alliance was over, replaced by the grim reality of war. In the initial months of the war, the conflict resembled a more traditional, conventional military campaign. General Emilio Aguinaldo and his military advisors attempted to fight the Americans on their own terms, organizing the Filipino army along a European model. They established fixed battle lines, dug elaborate systems of trenches, and sought to engage the United States Army in set-piece battles. This strategy was born of a desire to prove the legitimacy of the Philippine Republic. By fighting a conventional war, they hoped to demonstrate that they were not a mere band of rebels, but a disciplined national army capable of defending its sovereignty on the field of battle. This approach, however, played directly into the strengths of the American military. The United States Army, though relatively small, was a professional force with superior training, discipline, and, most importantly, firepower. They were equipped with modern artillery and Krag-Jorgensen repeating rifles, which vastly outmatched the assortment of older Mausers and Remington rifles used by the Filipinos. In a series of major engagements north and south of Manila throughout 1899, American forces consistently broke through Filipino lines. The Battle of Manila in February was followed by advances that captured key cities like Malolos, the capital of the Philippine Republic, forcing Aguinaldo's government to become a government on the run. Despite their bravery and determination, the Filipino soldiers could not withstand the relentless American advance. Each battle followed a similar, heartbreaking pattern. The Filipinos would defend their positions fiercely, often inflicting significant casualties on the attackers, but would ultimately be forced to retreat in the face of overwhelming American artillery and infantry assaults. The Americans controlled the seas, allowing them to land troops anywhere they pleased and outflank Filipino defenses. The war became a slow, grinding push into the heart of Luzon, with the Filipino army constantly falling back, losing men, territory, and vital supplies with each engagement. By November 1899, it was clear that the strategy of conventional warfare had failed. The Filipino army was shattered as a cohesive fighting force, and its leadership recognized that continuing to fight in this manner would lead to total annihilation. After a council of war, Aguinaldo made a fateful decision that would dramatically change the nature of the conflict. He officially disbanded the regular army and ordered his commanders to transition to a new form of resistance guerrilla warfare. This marked the end of the first phase of the war. The fight for independence was not over. It was about to enter a new, more desperate, and far more brutal stage that would pull the entire civilian population into the vortex of violence. With the formal Filipino army dissolved, the The war transformed into a decentralized and relentless guerrilla conflict. Filipino fighters, organized into small mobile units, abandoned their uniforms and melted into the civilian population. They used their intimate knowledge of the terrain, the dense jungles, rugged mountains, and winding trails, to their advantage. Their strategy was one of attrition and harassment. They conducted lightning raids on American patrols and supply lines, ambushed isolated garrisons, and then vanished back into the villages and forests. For the American soldiers, the enemy was now everywhere and nowhere at once. Every villager could be a potential fighter, and every quiet trail could hide a deadly trap. This shift in tactics deeply frustrated the American military command, which was unprepared for this type of asymmetrical warfare. In response, the United States Army adopted a series of harsh counterinsurgency measures that blurred the line between combatant and civilian. The goal was to sever the connection between the guerrillas and the populace that supported them. One of the most infamous of these policies was the reconcentration system. American forces would forcibly round up entire village populations and herd them into designated zones or camps. Anyone found outside these zones was considered an enemy combatant and could be shot on sight. These camps were often overcrowded and unsanitary, leading to widespread disease and starvation, killing tens of thousands of civilians. To extract information about guerrilla movements, American soldiers resorted to torture. The most notorious of these methods was the water cure, a form of waterboarding where large amounts of water were forced down a victim's throat until their stomach was distended, after which they would be beaten or kicked until they regurgitated the water. This process was repeated until the prisoner gave information or died. These brutal tactics were not isolated incidents but were employed systematically in some areas. Perhaps the most extreme example of this brutality came from General Jacob H. Smith, who, in retaliation for a guerrilla ambush that killed an American company on the island of Samar, issued an infamous order to his men to kill every male over the age of 10 and turn the island into a howling wilderness. These measures created a climate of terror and devastation across the archipelago. The war became a cycle of violence where guerrilla attacks were met with devastating reprisals against civilian communities, entire villages were burned to the ground, crops and livestock were destroyed, and the social fabric of the Philippines was torn apart. While these tactics were effective in gradually crushing the resistance, they came at an almost unimaginable human cost. The fight for independence had descended into a desperate struggle for survival, and the American mission to civilize the Filipinos had revealed a dark and violent side of the nation's character that many at home refused to acknowledge. The Philippine-American War was, above all, a human catastrophe, and its deadliest impact was felt not by the soldiers in the field, but by the civilian population. The exact number of casualties will never be known with certainty, but historical estimates paint a horrifying picture of the conflict's toll. While around 4,200 American soldiers died in the war, the number of Filipino casualties was orders of magnitude higher. It is estimated that at least 20,000 Filipino soldiers were killed in combat. This figure, however, is dwarfed by the number of civilians who perished from famine, disease, and the direct violence of the war. Conservative estimates place the civilian death toll at around 200,000. But many historians argue that the true figure could be as high as 1 million people. This staggering loss of life has led some scholars and commentators to label the conflict a forgotten genocide. The term is controversial, but it speaks to the scale of the devastation and the nature of the American counterinsurgency campaign, which often failed to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. The reconcentration policy was a primary driver of these deaths. By forcing people into squalid camps and destroying their food sources, the American military created conditions ripe for epidemics of cholera, dysentery, and malaria. The war was not just fought with bullets, it was fought with starvation and disease, turning vast regions of the country into landscapes of death and suffering. The words of the leaders on both sides reveal the vast gulf in perspective. President William McKinley justified the American presence with a paternalistic and religious fervor, famously claiming that the decision to annex the Philippines came to him after praying for guidance. He said, "There was nothing left for us to do but to take them all, and to educate the Filipinos, and uplift and civilize and Christianize them." This benevolent rhetoric stood in stark contrast to the brutal reality on the ground and the desires of the Filipino people. McKinley's vision was one of imperial duty. seeing the Filipinos as little brown brothers in need of American guidance, unable to govern themselves. Emilio Aguinaldo, on the other hand, articulated the profound sense of betrayal and the unyielding desire for freedom. In a manifesto to the Filipino people he declared, "It is with a bitterness passing all description that I have to say to you, we have been deceived." He saw the conflict not as an insurrection but as a defense of national honor and sovereignty. "Struggle then, my countrymen, without fainting, without hesitation, without fear," he urged. "Strive for your independence and for that of your children." These two quotes encapsulate the fundamental clash of the war. One side's proclaimed mission of benevolent assimilation against another's desperate, bloody fight for self-determination. The turning point in the war came not on a battlefield, but through an act of daring deception. For 2 years, Emilio Aguinaldo had been the elusive symbol of the Filipino resistance, directing the guerrilla war from a series of hidden headquarters in the remote mountains of northern Luzon. American forces hunted him relentlessly, knowing that his capture would be a devastating blow to the morale of the Filipino cause. In March 1901, General Frederick Funston devised an audacious plan. Using a group of Filipino soldiers loyal to the Americans, known as the Macabebe Scouts, Funston and a few other American officers posed as prisoners of war. They forged documents and sent messages ahead to Aguinaldo, claiming they were bringing captured Americans to him. The ruse worked perfectly. Aguinaldo, believing he was about to receive valuable prisoners, welcomed the party into his secret camp in Palanan. Once inside, the prisoners and their Macabebe guards quickly overpowered Aguinaldo's small security detail and captured the Filipino president. He was taken to Manila where, under pressure from American authorities, he was persuaded to swear an oath of allegiance to the United States. On April 19, 1901, he issued a proclamation to his followers, calling on them to lay down their arms. "Let the stream of blood cease to flow. Let there be an end to tears and desolation," he wrote, acknowledging that the Philippines was irrevocably committed to the sovereignty of the United States. Aguinaldo's capture and his subsequent appeal for peace broke the back of the organized national resistance. One by one, other major Filipino generals began to surrender, recognizing that the fight could not be sustained without their central leader. Although scattered resistance continued for years, particularly in the southern Moro provinces, the main conflict was effectively over. On July 4, 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt officially declared that the Philippine insurrection had ended and proclaimed a full and complete pardon and amnesty to all former revolutionaries. The American military government was replaced by a civilian one, headed by William Howard Taft, who would become the first American Governor-General of the Philippines. The end of the war did not bring immediate independence. Instead, it marked the beginning of nearly half a century of American colonial rule. The United States set about establishing a government, a public education system, and infrastructure projects, all designed to remake the Philippines in its own image. While some of these initiatives brought tangible benefits, they were implemented within a framework of colonial control. Filipinos were granted limited self-government, but remained subjects of the United States. The immense sacrifice of the war, the hundreds of thousands of lives lost, had not resulted in the freedom for which they had fought, but in the trading of one colonial master for another. Remembering the Philippine-American War is essential, because it fundamentally shaped the identities of both nations, and set precedents that echo to this day. For the United States, it was its first major overseas war of conquest, and its first experience with a protracted counterinsurgency campaign. The conflict forced Americans to confront a deep contradiction in their national identity. A nation born from an anti-colonial revolution had become a colonial power itself. This sparked a fierce debate at home, giving rise to the American Anti-Imperialist League, which included prominent figures like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and William Jennings Bryan. They argued that imperialism was betraying America's democratic principles, a debate that continues to resurface in modern discussions of American foreign policy. The tactics used in the Philippines, reconcentration camps, torture, and the targeting of civilians, provided a dark blueprint for future conflicts. The language of civilizing missions and benevolent assimilation became a recurring justification for American interventions around the world. The war demonstrated the immense difficulty of imposing rule on a population that does not want it, and the moral compromises that often accompany such efforts. It stands as a cautionary tale about the temptations of empire and the human cost of projecting power abroad, a lesson that remains deeply relevant in the 21st century as the nation grapples with its role as a global superpower. For the Philippines, the war's legacy is one of profound loss and a complicated, enduring relationship with the United States. The conflict decimated a generation of its leaders, shattered its economy, and delayed its independence until 1946. The American colonial period that followed brought education and infrastructure, but also created a political and economic system that was heavily dependent on the United States, fostering a neo-colonial relationship that persisted long after formal independence. The war left deep scars on the national psyche, a traumatic memory of a struggle for freedom that was brutally suppressed by a nation that claimed to be a champion of liberty. Ultimately, forgetting this war does a disservice to the history of both countries. It erases the memory of the hundreds of thousands of Filipinos who died for their independence and ignores a pivotal moment when America chose the path of empire. To remember the Philippine-American War is not to cast simple blame, but to seek a more honest and complete understanding of the past. It forces us to acknowledge the complexities and contradictions of history, to honor the sacrifices of those who fought on both sides, and to reflect on the enduring questions of freedom,